My name is Abby Edens. I'm Director of Education at the National World War II Museum, and I want to welcome you to our Lunchbox Lecture Program. Today's program is made possible through our sponsor, AARP Louisiana. Our presenter today is Captain Rick Jacobs, who will be speaking on the topic of the Munich Agreement. On September 30th, 1938, Nazi Germany entered an agreement with the United Kingdom, France, and Italy, approving the annexation of Sudetenland. In this lecture, Rick will be describing the efforts that led to the signing of the agreement and how it kicked off what became World War II. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Captain Jacobs.
Thank you, Abby. Napoleon and the French Revolution unleashed the forces of nationalism, fighting to replace kingdoms with nations. The Congress of Vienna put the genie back in the bottle for a while, but from the ruins of the Holy Roman Empire, Germany began to emerge or change from a linguistic to a geographic reality, culminating in the creation of the Second German Reich after the Franco-Prussian War. Two French provinces, Alsace and Lorraine, were annexed by the victorious Germans, a permanent wound and a principal cause of the First World War. The French were further humiliated with a victory parade in Paris and the coronation of the King of Prussia as Emperor of the Germans at the Palace of Versailles. Chapter 2, the Great War, came 40 years later and brought victory for France, but at a terrible cost. 1.3 million killed and 4 million wounded, 27% of Frenchmen between 18 and 27, an eighth of the population were casualties. Preceding the generals and their glorious introduction to the victory parade were 1,000 of the wounded, a grim reminder of the cost of victory. France was determined on revenge. Alsace and Lorraine were repatriated and a large monetary reparation levied on Germany. Claiming not just force majeure, but moral superiority, the treaty included the notorious guilt clause, stating, and I quote, "Germany accepts the responsibility for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies." The treaty was a national humiliation, which the Germans signed at bayonet point. Versailles was, as David Fromkin wrote, the peace to end all peace, which, by the way, is a very good book. At the insistence of Woodrow Wilson, the German and Austrian monarchies were abolished, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved, thus eliminating centuries-old institutions of stable government. Wilson's 14 points, a nebulous proclamation of war aims, declared the right of people to self-determination. Unanswered was the question of which people and what borders would these countries have. Where was Poland? Should it have the borders of 1790, 1713, 1683? There was the District of Poland, which was once part of the kingdom, but had been German since 1815. There are a majority of Germans in some place and a majority of Poles elsewhere. Czechoslovakia had Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, and Poles in substantial numbers, along with 7 million Germans formerly part of Austria, but never part of the German Reich. The Baltic republics and Russia had similar problems. From 1918 to 1923, these borders were largely determined in the traditional way, by war. After the Great War, prominent French intellectuals such as Jean-Paul Sartre and his mistress Simone de Beauvoir founded pacifist associations, ascribing the carnage to callous, incompetent generals and inept politicians, an opinion with a substantial degree of truth. They thought war was a nightmare without purpose, never to be repeated. The pacifists rejected the very legitimacy of war and the social order that produced it. A cynical indolence replaced patriotism. De Beauvoir wrote of Hitler coming to power, quote, "Like everyone else on the French left, we watched these developments quite calmly. There was no threat to peace. The only danger was the panic that the right was attempting to spread in France with the aim of dragging us into war. We refused to envisage the very possibility of war. They had ignored Trotsky's dictum, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." The 340,000 French Communist Party members, including de Beauvoir and Sartre, were inspired and at times directed by Moscow. Organized bands of thugs from the left and right fought each other and the police. 40,000 rioted in 1934. In 1936, the Popular Front, a coalition of socialists and communists, put 500,000 rioters in the streets and brought down the government. A general strike by 2 million workers soon followed, which ended only when the government mandated collective bargaining and annual paid holidays, a 40-hour week, and raises for all. Business costs doubled. The cost of living increased by 50%. French production in 1938 was 25% lower than in 1930. German output was 30% higher. In 1848, Karl Marx wrote, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." By 1917, the specter was manifest. As the communist revolution bloodily triumphed in Russia, Lenin roused the mob and commenced annihilating the bourgeoisie with the fervent faith of one who holds himself to be on the right side of history. There was plenty to fear from the murderous regimes of Lenin and Stalin, their reign of terror, and their international ambitions. American journalist Lincoln Steffens echoed the naivete of many down the decades, writing in 1919, "I have been into the future, and it works." Lenin calls such people useful idiots. In 1928, Stalin undertook the destruction of the kulaks and small businessmen, then engineered the Great Famine in the Ukraine. At least 3 million perished, with estimates as high as 12 million. Nonetheless, Walter Duranty, the New York Times correspondent in Russia, wrote, "Any report of a famine in Russia is an exaggeration or malignant propaganda." In the Great Purge, Stalin eliminated the old guard of the Communist Party and the leadership of the Red Army, exterminating over 1 million people, including nearly everyone in the army above the rank of lieutenant colonel. Duranty again defended the tyrant, another useful idiot for the revolution. The Red Army fought a civil war at home and invaded Poland and the Baltic states. The German army, officially limited to 100,000, defended its eastern borders with the Freikorps, paramilitary forces composed of demobilized soldiers that kept their weapons, uniforms, and organization at the company level or higher. Among them was Corporal Adolf Hitler. The gravest threat to Germany, though, was not from invasion, but internal. The economy collapsed and starvation stalked the land. Karl Liebknecht, a leader of the communist Spartacist movement, declared the creation of the Free Socialist Republic of Germany. Revolution broke out in Berlin. The Weimar government sent in the Freikorps. For veterans of the awful carnage of the Great War, collateral damage was not a factor. Notice the bodies in the street on the right. The Freikorps crushed the rebellion, murdered Liebknecht and the prominent communist theorist Rosa Luxemburg. Communists also seized power in Munich. Power was initially exercised by the coffeehouse anarchists, whose first act was to plead for new art forms in sculpture, drama, painting, and architecture, which would permit the liberation of the spirit of mankind. These lunatics ruled for just 6 days before more serious-minded Marxists took charge and, like communist regimes down through the ages, quickly set about murdering their political opponents. 3 weeks later, 30,000 Freikorps systematically reconquered Bavaria and undertook their own reign of terror. Hitler emerged from this milieu of communist threat and German anarchy to become chancellor in 1933. He crushed internal resistance and restored the economy by rebuilding the German war machine. In 1935, he announced the existence of the Luftwaffe, introduced conscription, expanded the Wehrmacht to 600,000, and started U-boat construction, all violations of the now defunct Treaty of Versailles. Germany was the only great power without massive unemployment, beggary, or hunger. Freed from the shackles of the worldwide depression, Germany's income doubled, production rose 102%, generating a crest of affluence, euphoria, and throbbing patriotism, while producing adoration for Hitler, along with growing respect and fear of Germany across Europe, inspiring fascists abroad in England, America, and elsewhere. Hitler believed himself the instrument of fate. I am destined to be the Führer who will bring all Germans into the greater German Reich. Note that expression, all Germans. The Teutonic people began the Drang nach Osten, the march to the east, in the time of Charlemagne. German-speaking communities extended as far as the Urals. Germany was too small to support all of this master race, so Hitler would seize the necessary living room German Lebensraum in Poland, the Ukraine, and beyond. The plan was spelled out in Mein Kampf, although omitted from the English language edition. To strike east, Germany needed to secure its rear by fortifying the west bank of the Rhine, demilitarized at Versailles. Otherwise, if they attacked east, the French army would simply march into the industrial heartland of the Reich. At dawn on March 7, 1936, with just a single division in reserve, a handful of German battalions crossed the Rhine. It was a totally inadequate force to meet a counterstroke by the much larger and better equipped French army. Hitler, not yet absolute dictator, gambled his whole future on this bluff. The Wehrmacht feared disaster. The Minister of War was prepared to withdraw if the French moved, and Hitler's government would have fallen. Unfortunately, General Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief who so disastrously led the Battle of France 5 years later, insisted that his army was a purely defensive force and suggested the government lodge a vigorous protest with the League of Nations. Counseled by caution, riven by social unrest, France was unwilling to begin what might be another world war, and so, despite overwhelming force, did nothing. In Britain, many thought Germany was simply correcting an injustice of Versailles, comparing it to a man going into his own backyard. Neville Chamberlain, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, told the French foreign minister public opinion would not support sanctions of any kind. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin feared triggering another world war, which would probably result in Germany going Bolsheviks. He believed peace was worth taking almost any risk. Having gained the Rhineland without firing a shot, Hitler delivered the first of several peace speeches, declaring the Third Reich would unconditionally respect the territorial provisions of Versailles. Hitler's popularity and political power soared. He seemed to understand political military dynamics better than the generals and ministers. Success confirmed his contempt for the democratic powers. In Britain, the horrors of the Great War also loomed large. 750,000 dead, another 1.6 million wounded, 500,000 widows and fatherless children. The enormous economic costs of the war consumed British financial reserves, leaving it heavily in debt to the United States. Morally and financially exhausted, Britain lacked the will for a strong foreign policy and the military wherewithal to back it. At the Battle of Jutland in 1916, 37 British capital ships in a fleet of 150 combatants fought the German High Seas Fleet in the greatest fleet-to-fleet action of all time. In 1939, with imperial and Commonwealth responsibilities no less than a generation earlier, Great Britain mustered just 15 capital ships, only 2 of which were completed after 1918. The rest of the Royal Navy was similarly shrunken and obsolescent. Instead of her time-honored strategy of a strong navy, Britain relied on peace treaties and the fantasy of collective security through the League of Nations. British impotence was codified in the 10-year rule. In 1919, at the suggestion of Winston Churchill, military spending was made on the premise of no major war for 10 years. In 1928, again at the instigation of Churchill, now Chancellor of the Exchequer, the rule was made self-perpetuating. Spending fell from £766 million in 1919 to £102 million in 1932, devastating military preparedness. In 1931, the first Sea Lord wrote he was unable to protect both the home islands and meet British obligations in the Far East. Indeed, when Japan attacked in 1941, the most the Royal Navy could do was send a symbolic, suicidal mission of 2 capital ships to Singapore. The 10-year rule was repealed in 1932, but with the proviso this must not be taken to justify expanding defense expenditures, without regard to the serious financial and economic situation of the Great Depression. British military spending rose grudgingly, while Germany rearmed at a blistering pace. Meanwhile, the Great Depression ravaged the economy. In 1932, 25% of the British workforce had no job. In parts of the country, the figure was as high as 70%, with consequent domestic turbulence. Communism, new, virile, and virulent, attracted many. By 1938, there were 18,000 dues-paying members of the Communist Party of Great Britain. Lenin engineered the October Revolution with fewer followers. Prime Minister Baldwin thought Hitler a counterpoise against the ambitions of the Soviet Union. It shielded Britain against the Bolsheviks. Germany had no desire on Western Europe, he claimed. The Fuhrer wanted to move east, and if he should, it would not break my heart, said Baldwin. Prominent Englishmen, including leading newspaper publishers, gave a deferential, even obsequious picture of the new Germany as a socially progressive nation with falling unemployment. Despite the Great Depression, the Spectator magazine thought Hitler the hope of a tormented world. British ambassador to Germany received very precise instructions to improve relations with Germany and the Nazi leadership, a policy he zealously executed, writing that too many people in England have an entirely erroneous conception of National Socialism, that great social experiment. Pacifism was rife in Britain as well. In 1929, Robert Graves published Goodbye to All That, a milestone of growing disenchantment with the Great War. Reflecting that feeling, the Oxford Union debated and passed the resolution, "This House refuses to fight for king and country." The dictators took note of this attitude of the elite of Britain. German rearmament, particularly the expanding Luftwaffe, meant admiration, pacifism, and fear marched side by side. Military wisdom, enthralled by the theories of Giulio Douay, preached there was no defense from aerial bombardment. The bomber would always get through and inevitably decimate the population. Prime Minister Baldwin thought the very first air raid would leave 60,000 dead in London. In fact, only, if I may use that word, 90,000 Britons died from bombing during the entire war. Italy fought alongside Britain and France in the Great War, but thought itself shortchanged at Versailles, its territorial ambitions in the former Austrian Empire largely ignored. In 1922, Benito Mussolini, a wounded veteran in the fighting, became prime minister and introduced the world to a new totalitarian philosophy, fascism. He did not support Hitler initially. Until the mid-30s, Italy opposed German expansionism and further revision of Versailles, and actively opposed Hitler's ambitions in Austria. In 1936, Italy and Germany signed the Axis alliance. What had happened? In October 1935, Italy undertook the conquest of Ethiopia. Poison gas and air attacks were used against the militarily primitive natives, creating an uproar in the international community, but no action. Emperor Haile Selassie fled Addis Ababa in May, then gave a stirring speech to an impotent and indifferent League of Nations. Britain and France condemned Italy, but did nothing. Vilified and diplomatically isolated, Mussolini turned to Hitler. Meanwhile, the threat of Japan loomed in the Far East. An ally during World War I, in the 1920s and 30s, the Japanese military took control of the government. The Army's principal interest was China, where it had been campaigning since the 1890s and was a law unto itself. Conquering Manchuria largely on its own initiative, it was branded an aggressor by the League of Nations, so Japan quit that organization and signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Germany and Italy in 1936. The following year, Army firebrands engineered the Marco Polo Bridge incident and invaded China proper. Posing as liberators from white colonialism, Japan's powerful, belligerent military was a dire threat to the overstretched, underfunded imperial defenses of Britain and France in Asia. Britain's first Sea Lord explained the disaster of alienating Italy as Germany rearmed and Japanese hostility increased. I quote, "British diplomacy raised a third potential enemy, endangering the main imperial line of communication, the Mediterranean. Britain had no imperial interest in Ethiopia, but chose to align itself against Italy in the League of Nations in the cause of collective security, largely because of pressure of public opinion as influenced by vociferous idealists. The strategic consequences were a disaster. This miserable business of collective security has run away with our traditional interests. We now have to be prepared to fight any nation in the world at any time." Another threat to democracy came from Spain, where in the early 30s, a loose coalition of communists, anarchists, and socialists took over the Spanish government, proposing drastic reductions of wealth and property, land reform and workers' rights, reducing the size and power of the army, curbing the role of the Catholic Church, all undeterred by the fact they had less than 50% of the vote. Like Lenin, they did not seek the people's agreement to deliver utopia. In 1936, following the murder of the conservative leader Calvo Sotelo, General Francisco Franco took control of the Spanish Army of Africa, which was then airlifted to Spain by the Luftwaffe. 3 years of civil war followed, as Franco's nationalists, supporting the Catholic Church and the traditional power structure, fought government forces known as loyalists or republicans. The loyalists were bitterly divided between Republican, communist, and anarchist factions, who at times fought one another rather than Franco. Russian support brought both weapons and commissars to enforce communist orthodoxy, as Stalin's secret police and teams of murderers unceasingly terrorized and manipulated the loyalist leadership. They were trying to annihilate the Trotskyites amongst them. At Badajoz and elsewhere, national troops and vigilantes slaughtered their enemies. At Paracuellos, the loyalists followed suit. In just 2 months, perhaps 12,000 nationalist political prisoners, soldiers, and priests were killed by the Republicans. If you look on the slide, that gentleman at the upper right holding a pistol in his hand, look at the smile on his face. A good day's work, eh? Loyalists were not just hostile to the church, they tortured priests, raped nuns, and slaughtered innocents. Fanatics set fire to churches, seized public and private buildings, destroying property and other legal records. Morality was notably absent on both sides. They were ruled by men who saw no place on earth for their opponents, committing abominable atrocities upon enemies and innocents alike. Both nationalists and loyalists hurled prisoner from the bridge at Ronda. 40,000 volunteers from France, Germany, Britain, and America joined the Loyalists, including Ernest Hemingway and his soon-to-be wife, Martha Gellhorn. Writers and intellectuals in the West were almost unanimous in support of the Republicans. They regarded it as a matter of moral justice in the progressive community. You can judge the tone from the film The Spanish Earth, available on YouTube, written by Hemingway and John Dos Passos, narrated by Orson Welles. It is awash in its own righteousness. There were nearly 300,000 combat casualties, plus 150,000 or more civilians killed. Franco emerged victorious and in debt to the Axis, but it was a debt he declined to pay when it came due. These were dangerous times in which Hitler took the next step towards Lebensraum. In February 1938, as large pro-Nazi demonstrations convulsed Austria, Hitler summoned the Austrian Chancellor, Kurt von Schuschnigg, to Berchtesgaden. There he gave him a furious browbeating. He thundered that either Austria merged with the Reich or the German army would invade in a matter of weeks. Thinking the small Austrian army would be helpless against the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, Schuschnigg, in desperation, announced a plebiscite on unification in just 4 days, leaving the Nazis no time to organize their vote. Hitler responded by ordering the army to be in Vienna in 3 days, producing chaos in the Wehrmacht. Hitler himself was in a state bordering on hysteria, particularly anxious over how Mussolini, who in the past had opposed German expansion into Austria, would react. He was ecstatic when Mussolini said he had no objections and promised Il Duce unlimited loyalty in the future. The French wanted the British to join them in a strongly worded statement, but London replied it could not act against the wishes of a very considerable portion of the population. A well-placed member of the government wrote, "We cannot fight. Austria's incorporation into the Reich was probably inevitable, and to stop it from outside is impossible and indefensible." When combined with the understandable revulsion at resuming the slaughter of 1914 to 18, the words impossible and indefensible reveal the depths of British defeatism. The Austrian government capitulated. Everywhere the German forces were joyfully received. Hitler entered Austria the same day as the panzers, met by jubilant crowds that thronged the road in Linz, his hometown, where he was greeted by a hysterical crowd of 100,000 people. It was a catastrophe for the Jews of Austria. They were randomly subjected to beatings, tortures, and looting. Jewish shops were ransacked. Jews were stripped of their possessions in the street, forced to hand over cars, jewelry, money before being beaten. Borders were sealed and a reign of terror began. American journalist William Shirer said he witnessed an orgy of sadism worse than anything he had seen in Germany. Jewish men and women of all ages were systematically dragged from their homes or press-ganged off the streets by truncheon-wielding stormtroopers. Surrounded by jeering crowds, they were put to cleaning squads, forced to scrub the pavements using an acid solution that burned their hands. "Work for the Jews," the crowd chanted. "Work for the Jews." The Nazis gloated as supervisors kicked the Jewish workers. Look on the upper right, and you'll see a rather gleeful expression on those two fellas, one in uniform and the fellow to his left. All smiles, eh? Boarding a plane, Baron Louis de Rothschild's passport was torn up by a German officer, and he was told, "You Jews will never have passports again." Adolf Eichmann, a rising star, headed the Office of Jewish Immigration, the only agency which could authorize Jews to leave. 100,000 were allowed to go in return for all they possessed. Rothschild was allowed to leave only after his palace was looted and he handed over his steel mills to the Nazis. Out of nearly 200,000 Austrian Jews, only 3,000 remained after the war. 64,000 lost their lives in the Shoah. Many of the survivors emigrated to Israel, their only refuge. Hitler correctly judged the great powers would do nothing. France, under a caretaker government and given prevailing defensive military strategy, was impotent. The Great Purge had Stalin's full attention. Cordell Hull, the U.S. Secretary of State, raised no objections when the German ambassador called on him. In Britain, Neville Chamberlain dismissed wild stories of stormtroopers leading anti-Semitic pogroms. He said they were rubbish. If the persecutions were widespread, Hitler would get wind of them and jail those responsible. To hear Winston Churchill, Chamberlain went on, you would think the Fuhrer wanted to kill every Jew in Europe. A senior Foreign Office secretary remarked, "After all, it wasn't our business." How ill-judged that callous remark proved to be. Following the rape of Austria, Hitler declared he must bring the 7 million Germans in the Czech Sudetenland into the Reich, vowing that was the limit of his ambitions. He had no desire to add alien races to the Aryan state with further expansion. That was poppycock. To free his flank for the coming war, for Lebensraum in the east, all Czechoslovakia must be under German control. He wanted the war to start then and there, and told his generals the invasion would be at the beginning of October. At the Nuremberg rallies in 1938, Goering spoke to the vast, hysterical masses, calling the Czechs a miserable pygmy race, oppressing a cultured people, fronting from Moscow and the eternal mask of the Jew devil. Look at the size of that crowd. Hitler spoke on the last night of the rally, pausing his stream of vitriol whenever the huge packed stadium roared, "Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil." He raged against Czech President Eduard Beneš and his Jew plotters. Czechoslovakia, he said, was a monstrous formation. The Czechs prepared for war. They could field 30 to 40 well-armed and motivated divisions behind frontier fortifications second to none. Personally, I think they would have put up a stiff fight against the as yet untried Wehrmacht. France was treaty-bound to defend Czechoslovakia, but her military strategy was based on the fortified Maginot Line. Having built such magnificent defenses, they thought it mad to take the offensive, particularly against the fortifications of the West Wall. Added to continuing eternal dissent, France was unwilling to exert diplomatic or military pressure on Germany. Neville Chamberlain, now Prime Minister in Great Britain, with a self-appointed mission to come to terms with the dictators, told an agreeable cabinet the government would not attempt to match Germany in arms, but extend the hand of friendship. He passionately denounced the argument that appeasement encouraged Hitler. He said that it was a mischievous distortion and a cowardly surrender to warmongerism. In May 1938, after seizing Austria and as tension over Czechoslovakia escalated, England played a soccer match against Germany in Berlin. At the request of the British Foreign Office, and as directed by the head of the English Football Association, the English team gave the Nazi salute during the German national anthem. That is appeasement made manifest. To try to appreciate or understand the attitude of Chamberlain and so many others, consider these two striking contemporary paintings on the horrors of war. At the top, Guernica by Picasso evoked the notorious German bombing of the town in the Spanish Civil War. And Gassed by the famous John Singer Sargent was a scene he had witnessed during the Great War. To defeat Germany would mean a world war with all its horrors come again, now with huge civilian casualties from the powerful Luftwaffe and its unstoppable bombers, as they were believed to be. An understandable hesitation to resume such slaughter, compounded by pacifism, weakness, fear, and pessimism, produced appeasement. The British military opinion stated that defeating Germany was a doubtful proposition, given the parlous state of British arms. In March 1938, the RAF told Chamberlain it was not fit to undertake operations on a major war scale. The Admiralty and the Army concurred, asserting their forces were not ready for war. With convenient logic, the Imperial General Staff declared Germany would overrun Czechoslovakia in less than a week. Britain was not capable of beating Germany any sooner, so the Germans would conquer Czechoslovakia before anything could be done. Intervention was senseless. The editor of the influential New Statesman thought things had gone so far that armed resistance to the dictators was useless. If there was a war, we should lose it. We should seek the most peaceful way of letting them gradually get all they wanted. Convinced war meant certain devastation, his inherent desire for peace endorsed by the military, the press, and Parliament, Neville Chamberlain cabled Hitler proposing he come to Germany at once to find a peaceful solution to the Czech problem. On September 15, 1938, Chamberlain flew to Germany. There, Hitler dominated the conversation, running on and on. He vowed to solve the Czech issue one way or another. He was prepared to risk a world war. He asked if Britain would endorse liberation of the Sudetenland based on self-determination. Self-determination, that's a key phrase because that was Woodrow Wilson's phrase at Versailles. Self-determination was a near sacred principle as enunciated by the West, and now Hitler was invoking it for self-determination for the Germans in Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain responded he recognized the principle of the detachment of the Sudeten area. By doing so, he accepted the idea of dismembering Czechoslovakia without consulting Prague, his cabinet, or his colleagues in France. Returning to London, Chamberlain told the cabinet Hitler wanted only the Sudetenland and no Czechs in the Reich. He said Hitler was the commonest little dog, what a marvelous Victorian expression, but he would honor his word. He meant what he said. He is telling the truth. Chamberlain, of course, could not have been more mistaken. Britain and France put enormous diplomatic pressure on Czechoslovakia to yield to German demands. Czechoslovakia was told it would bear the responsibility for war. The English would declare themselves neutral. When war starts, France would not take part. She would not fulfill her treaty obligations. When questioned in Parliament, the government said it had done no such thing. So the big lie was not the unique province of the dictators, as we see politicians often reach for the big lie, no matter how they got to office. On September 22nd, Chamberlain and Hitler met at Godesberg on the Rhine. Hitler's goal remained to go to war, and he rejected a plebiscite and demanded the Sudetenland be ceded in 9 days, or else the Wehrmacht would march. Chamberlain told the press war or peace was up to the Czechs and returned to England. He told the cabinet, Hitler said, This was the last territorial demand. And Germany would guarantee Czechoslovakia's frontiers afterwards. Chamberlain stressed the Fuhrer had spoken with great earnestness and concluded he would accept Hitler's terms and advise the Czechs to do so. Instead, Beneš mobilized the Czech army. War was imminent. Chamberlain spoke as follows on the BBC. How horrible, fantastic, incredible. We should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. With Hitler's ultimatum due to expire the next day, Chamberlain asked Mussolini to intervene. Il Duce phoned Berlin and persuaded Hitler to hold another round of talks that they would be held in Munich and would include Mussolini and the French Prime Minister. When Chamberlain informed the Commons, there was a moment of silence. Then the whole House burst into a roar of cheering. One man was silent and stayed seated, Winston Churchill. The Munich conference itself was anticlimactic. The fate of Czechoslovakia, a foregone conclusion. Hitler refused to negotiate, emphatically restating his demands and threatening war. At 1 a.m. on September 30th, Chamberlain capitulated. Czechoslovakia should begin evacuation of the Sudetenland at once. All Czechs must be gone in 10 days. Hitler yielded nothing. Every outrageous demand he made had been meekly met. A few hours later, with Chamberlain yawning from his fatigue, the Czech observers were told, they were observers, they did not get to participate in the talks. They were told, with no show of embarrassment, their approval was not necessary. The agreement was final. Chamberlain did get Hitler to sign a codicil affirming future amicable relations and agreeing to consult Britain and France to assure the peace of Europe. Hitler signed absent-mindedly because he put no value in this treaty. Having promised to honor the shrunken borders of Czechoslovakia, 6 months later, he seized the rest of that country. Chamberlain thought the codicil a diplomatic triumph. He said to Parliament, quote, he had dealt not merely with the Czech crisis, but the causes for the armaments race. Further agreements would stop the arms race, and Britain should not make a great increase in our armaments program. It was a great step toward the pacification of Europe, progress along the road to sanity. The real triumph of Munich was it has shown 4 great powers can agree by discussion instead of by force of arms, and thereby a catastrophe was averted, which would have ended civilization as we have known it. Simone de Beauvoir wrote, a great wave of rejoicing swept over Paris. People sang and laughed together. I was delighted and felt not the faintest pang of conscience. I felt I had escaped death. Churchill, then an outcast far from the levers of power, said, they have traded honor for peace, and now they shall have neither. Churchill went on, it was a total and unmitigated defeat, sordid and suicidal. He said in Parliament, quote, do not suppose that this is the end. This is only the beginning of the reckoning, the first foretaste of a bitter cup. Thanks to Munich, Hitler now controlled Central Europe, the sine qua non of his war for Lebensraum. He acquired the substantial Czech armaments industry, which equipped the Wehrmacht throughout the coming war. Success again showed Hitler on the right side of history, a master of military and diplomatic action. Stalin, observing the passivity of Britain and France, soon signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, the green light for the invasion of Poland, and the start of World War II. Chamberlain's self-defined mission to come to terms with the dictators required a willing suspension of disbelief regarding Hitler's ambitions and repeated lies. In modern parlance, Chamberlain demonstrated a fatal confirmation bias. He ignored Trotsky's dictum. He was not interested in war, but war was interested in him. Thank you.
Excellent. So, Captain Jacobs, we do have a question here. Germany was in depression in 1932. Where did it get the money to pay for its aggression over the next 8 years? What fraction was taken from the Jewish people?
I couldn't tell you what the fractions were, but essentially Hitler revived the economy by firing up the arms industry. There was, boy, it's a whole nother discussion, but there was a finance guy in Germany who figured these things out, how to come up with the money to support Hitler's programs. And of course, it was a rolling thing. As more people were employed, more products flowed, more funds in payroll went into the economy, and things burgeoned. But I'm not an economic historian, so that's a bit outside my province.